I'm going to open it up.
Only one brief thing to say, that I think that the other area where there is scope for improvement, and having been witness to some of the last-minute scrabbling around that there was in order to produce the survey report, with sort of data in it that was acceptable or least unacceptable to the majority, an improved process for survey and ongoing monitoring, I think, is something that's going to be terribly important.
Okay, good. So some ideas in there around more voice and potentially more choice post-2010. Matthew, I might come back and press you on what changing the indicators more fundamentally means. It's a tempting point, but I'd like to know a bit more about that. But also, the role for the UN in all of this, that this has been an exercise very much housed within a particular club, if you like, a particular donor club. To what extent does it need to move out of that club post-2010? And what will it mean for the traction this particular agenda has? I think this is a great vision, but we need to be clear whether or not that we're trading off some things in that process. A comment over there. Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Philip Sigley, Federation of Cocoa Commerce. I don't know how many private sector people there are in the audience, but probably very few. The title of this discussion was about aid effectiveness, and I think we've heard a lot about all of the bureaucratic, difficulties, etc., and not enough about what's happening on the ground. Now, it just seems that everything is overcomplicated. I've never actually had a good dialogue with anybody from a development agency, because it always seems to be rather like going down to my local council to ask about a planning application. But the real problem that I see is that if you go to some of the local authorities, to some of the communities in West Africa, you'll see very little progress. The budget support may not be delivering. Now, the reporting structures, and I've said this several times at these meetings, today there's been no mention of the private sector and effective public-private partnerships and the way in which aid could be made more effective, not only more effective, but sustainable. And by not embracing the mainstream markets, there's some very, very serious issues. Now, 3 weeks ago, if I can just continue, I went to the meeting of the EU development agencies, where they were looking at duplication, waste, and there was an estimated 5 to 7 billion euros wasted by duplication out of about 50 billion euros spent. Now, if you do go to some of these district assemblies, say in Ghana, you'll see various, projects from individual donors. They go, they come, they don't speak to each other. You can interview the district assembly people and look at all the reporting, and I've mentioned this before here, on several occasions. This is serious, serious stuff that we need to have some dialogue between the mainstream markets and the donor community. This is about aid effectiveness, not just about quantity and who's giving what. It's what you do with it. And I think with all the staff employed, we seem to have a rather self-serving situation here.
Okay, thank you. Any other? At the back there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Nalima Gulrajani. I'm a lecturer at Destin at the London School of Economics. My question is pretty much for the entire panel. I was wondering, are there any downsides to the sense of urgency that's emerging in the context of this crisis to spend aid money, to disperse money? How can we ensure that donors aren't just spending irresponsibly, they're not sponsoring white elephants, that existing projects are being monitored, and that the incentives now aren't being moved to basically a disbursement culture which funds anything at all, really?
Great, thank you. At the front here, Lynn.
Just to come back on this issue of having better indicators, I think one illustration of this problem is the indicator on getting aid on budget. So the Paris process attempts to look at how much aid donors were planning, had told governments they were going to be spending, and it looks at how much money they actually dispersed to a country in a particular year, how much actually made it into the budget of the country during that year. And it's actually looking particularly at the government sector. Now, there's a number of issues there. Number one, not all aid goes through the government, but all aid should be on budget. So we need to think about how we make sure that we get aid that is not going through government on the budget as well. That's really important. Number two, that indicator doesn't actually tell you whose fault it is that the aid isn't on budget. It could be that the donor has got the information to the country, but it's not been able to actually formally use that information to actually get it onto the budget. It could be that the donor got the information to the country, but not in the right format, and therefore that hindered the process of the country getting the money onto the budget. It could be that the donor did absolutely nothing in terms of getting the information. And we need to try and, if we're really to get accountability and progress here and decide who it is that needs to take action, we need to really focus down on who's on the different players and what role they have to play in actually getting the cogs of the process working.
Okay, great. Yes, over here. Can you introduce yourselves as you speak?
Yes, my name is Regina Memon from Accountability 21 and UNIFEM. And I would like to come back on the mutual accountability, which Matthew were talking about. I would like to know about. I understand that we still have a lack of mutual accountability at the moment, and is it not because it's a problem of a lack of communication? That means you give aid to countries to reduce poverty, and you give them directions how to use this aid. After that, there is no more follow-up. And 10 years later, you come back to ask for results. I don't know if you can talk about lack of mutual accountability, because when there is when you don't keep a contact, when you can't have a when you don't have follow-up, that's my problem. And I would like to come back also I would like to ask about change. Nick, we're talking about change. Is it a warning? Is it because I would like to know your personal opinion about how do you about this aid? How do your personal opinion? Are you satisfied for the moment what the countries doing with aid? That's why you are talking about the chain. The chain, is it a warning? Are you going to how are you going to change? Is it will you keep the same aid as is at the moment? How are you going to change? I don't know. I didn't understand very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? When there are yeah, Lenny.
Hi, Lenny Wild from ODI. Just a couple of quick points, if I may. One was that I really welcomed that most of our panellists have mentioned mutual accountability and that recognition of how crucial it is. But, I mean, one point that would be useful to have your thoughts on is that mutual accountability is still often between governments. And we'll have alongside that processes of domestic accountability and ownership, but the two aren't really coming together. So I'd welcome your thoughts on whether mutual accountability at a country level can be broadened out so that it is about kind of democratic ownership issues as well. And secondly, I welcome the point that we need to convince a wider group of stakeholders and engage them on these issues. And if we look particularly at public opinion, let's say in the UK, in the face of a recession, but also the ongoing debates and challenges about effectiveness and sometimes lack of effectiveness, is there a real challenge that public becomes quite put off support for aid, and how do we deal with that going forward?
Okay, great. Yes, please. One more question, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hans-Peter Ulrich, Civil Public Policy Consulting. I've just one question, really. Maybe each of the discussants can tell me their opinion about it. What is really aid effectiveness in the view of each of the discussants, and in which ways is the system not effective, and in how far does the debate here help us to overcome these issues of ineffectiveness?
All right.
I just wanted to come back very quickly on that point of mutual accountability. I think one of the challenges of mutual accountability is the link with domestic accountability. Often these processes of mutual accountability happen in a silo space, and they're not linked enough with discussions on domestic accountability. Why couldn't the process of periodically reviewing progress of donors, why couldn't that involve donors actually presenting something in Parliament and giving elected officials an opportunity to really hear about what's happening and to have their input into that process? And there you begin to link those processes.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to come back to the panel now. There are a number of issues raised by you. I'm going to start with Matthew and work through, but the ones that I heard that may want particular attention. I mean, just to respond here, I mean, I think what we're working with here is a framework around improving aid effectiveness that is already established in the context of the Paris Declaration, which is the basis on which we're trying to assess whether or not progress is being made and what needs to happen subsequently. And on that basis, I think we're all talking to the same agenda, but perhaps others will correct me. Points about opening up this debate to public-private discussions and challenges of duplication, which are actually at the core of the Paris agenda, of trying to reconcile and reduce problems of duplication and wastage. I mean, that's certainly one theme. Are there any downsides to dispersing rapidly in this current context? Is this opening a door, if you like, to regressive behaviour somehow that isn't tied into the learning that is embodied in Paris? Mutual accountability, I think there's an important debate there about what does good mutual accountability actually look like, and B, how does it relate to domestic accountability systems? Is there a risk, Lenny raised, that actually all this focus around aid effectiveness somehow challenges public support for the aid effort, which is an interesting question. And then also about what kind of change are we really looking for here? What would be a step change that we might be looking for post-2010? Matthew, a few thoughts on some of those?
Okay.
At high speed.
Yes. And a couple of other things as well. First of all, just to say in regard to what Rachel said about choice, and I think it is really vital that countries should have choice of where they get the money from, and occasionally have the ability to say no to donors, or yes, but we want you to change the way you deliver. But actually in the current crisis, a lot of those southern donors and other sources of alternative financing are drying up as well. So we need to be aware that I think the prospects for choice are not terribly wide at the moment. The issue about, well, to start probably with the most important question, the last one, which was what do we think aid effectiveness means? Aid which allows us to have MDG results, so that everybody reduces their poverty, so that everybody has better health and education and so on. Now, how do you get to that? We've just finished editing a book for the African Development Bank, which was a very large process of taking 4 countries, working all the way through from an aid commitment to the delivery, and saying, how do we actually make sure that it delivers results, and taking into account all the points that were made about duplication and the risks of budget support and so on. And the main conclusion was that at all stage, everybody has to be holding everybody else accountable. So that you have to have strong parliamentary structures, you have to have strong independent auditing structures, you have to have strong local community structures which can hold their local governments or their central governments accountable. And where you have that, you get the best results, regardless of the type of aid. Although I would say you probably get even better results from things like budget support in that context, because very often the way that donors structure multiple individual little projects leaves very little scope for that type of accountability at all stages of the process. So you need that, and that's precisely why I said if people like DFID are serious about mutual accountability, they have to invest in that. They can't just invest in global processes or in governments or in their own improvements and corporate plans. They have to invest in making sure that parliamentarians, local governments and civil society above all, the poor themselves, are able to hold people accountable for what they're doing with aid. Otherwise, I think there is a risk that we'll end up with the lack of improvement in the effectiveness of aid undermining the case for aid in the long term. There is certainly, at the developing country level and among developing country people, an increasing aid effectiveness fatigue. They hear all these speeches and declarations and everything else about how aid is going to become more effective, and they don't see massive changes on the ground. In some countries they do, because donors are performing better there, governments are doing better there. But in many countries they don't see that. And that's why you get a lot of people in Africa, and when we had this NGO conference in Accra, a lot of Africans said, well, we should just get rid of all the aid, as a la Dambisa Moyo. Now, that's a very strong, very simple message, and if we don't improve the way we deliver aid, that message will more and more come to haunt us.
Thank you. Nick?
An attempt at a couple of the many good questions that there are. I think the issue, taking up really where Matthew has left off, the issue about public perceptions and support being at risk, I think is real. I think, to be honest, I think there's a piece of work to be done to make sure that various different external factors that there are also playing on this, as well as the talk about ineffectiveness of aid, other external factors that there are in domestic environments due to the financial crisis, due to a whole range of other things that I won't go into, may mean that there is more of a battle to maintain public support for aid levels. And I think that there's a very serious challenge, actually, something I do want to mention that hasn't been mentioned yet, because we're here to talk about aid effectiveness and donor effectiveness and so forth, but I think that there is a very serious challenge recognised by most NGOs, that NGOs themselves have to do something to better describe the value and the worth of the spend that they make and of the commitment of public and private resources that they make it in the aid struggle. So I think that that's a very real point, and it's an important one, and NGOs are seized of that. Bond is running a process of work around NGO effectiveness for and with its members. I think that the issue of parliamentary accountability is an important one. In fact, in Accra there were a number of parliamentarians, not many actually, pitifully few really, but there were some there. The Association of Western European Parliamentarians and also South African, who I met, Ben Turok, who were very strong on articulating the need for parliamentary accountability within recipient countries and donor countries. Of course, we're familiar here with and Europe is familiar with the various different mechanisms and select committees and so forth, but that is not necessarily the case in recipient countries, and that there's a big role to be played there in increasing that voice and increasing that transparency within the democratic process. And donors also have a responsibility, I think, to continue to support the building of capacity for advocacy, for learning how to create better advocacy within civil societies in recipient countries, to be able to acquire the skills that are necessary to really hold their governments to account. That's important stuff too. There's a lot of other interesting issues that have been raised, but those are the ones that I wanted to speak to.
Thank you. Rachel?
Thanks. I mean, I think on this point that this all feels very bureaucratic and divorced from real results on the ground, I think it's just essential to remember that this is all about results, and it is underpinned by results. And this architecture to deliver effective aid is because we're absolutely sure that without these reforms, no citizen in a developing country will be able to see through the plethora of different aid instruments and different project and processes to have any idea about what results their government should be securing from the aid that's flowing in. And the whole purpose of this framework, that I admit, when you unpack it, it does go to bureaucratic issues. And I mean, I'd say that as a good thing. You know, bureaucracy isn't always a bad word, but it goes to issues about streamlined, transparent processes so that citizens can see what the collective of aid flowing into their country is supposed to deliver, when that aid is meant to come and what it's supposed to deliver. And that's why, you know, I think the points about getting aid visible to the budget are so important, that unless there is this absolute willingness to expose the flows of money to the citizens in country and to expose what that aid is meant to achieve to those citizens, you don't have a starting point to even have the discussion about what results are commensurate with that money. And I think it's just really important that you can't have a look at whether a government has delivered a health outcomes commensurate with the amount of money flowing in. You know, is this government doing a good job or not? You know, we really don't know those answers until we know how much money is flowing in. We can't answer the value for money questions until we've ticked off all these other parts of the system. And I think that's so. I mean, I absolutely take your point that it feels bureaucratic, but it's an underpinning for results.
I'm going to let you keep your conversation till what we've got
so
going
I think that's the point. I think your points that it still all feels the same at district level are also really important. And I think on this vision for the future, I think that's a fundamental issue, is how do you move this very central government agenda to the district level? And, you know, my own personal experience is when you get to the district level, not only do you have the donors there, you have the NGOs there en masse, and that the burden of procurement issues and and you get these issues of transaction costs in spades at district level, actually. And that also, I think, needs to be something we think about in the future, is where's the Paris for the agencies that are not working at central government level. On the question about do we think there's what's the downside of fast disbursement, I mean, I think there are 2 points there. I actually don't think they're the kind of due diligence concerns that you point to. I mean, I think one is we just don't know what the impact of the crisis will be. So it's just a really, really difficult decision to make, to front load your money, not knowing what the future will look like. I think the other issue, you know, I mean, the other concerns that are out there is that it's potentially inflationary. I mean, I just absolutely don't buy that in the current environment. I think we've got to decide if we believe in counter-cyclical policies in this country, to what extent we're going to support poor countries to also undertake fiscal stimulus in this crisis. And I think that work really needs to be done country by country to see what their macro situation can cope with.
Great, thank you. We started off with you, Jasmine. I'm going to give you the last couple of words before we close.
Thank you. Very briefly, because I know we've completely run out of time. On the private sector role, and I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, I think that is very important. We do need to do a better job as a whole community of recognising that more. Interesting, because the private sector is now represented on the OECD DAC body that deals with the aid effectiveness agenda, along with NGOs and some other different groupings, so this is also new. What we do need to keep in mind firstly is that for aid money, it has to be a poverty focus that we're asking for, so there are different things to consider there. Also, I would say that figure that you said about the 5 to 7 billion loss are due to ineffective aid, this is a study the Commission has been working on recently. I think it's important, this is really useful that they've brought this out, but it is important to say that value for money is not the only aspect of aid effectiveness that we're dealing with. They are using that in some ways to make sure they get better buy-in from all of Europe, from some of the governments that aren't so keen on the aid effectiveness agenda. So I think it is important that we do take on those crucial ownership, accountability and democracy issues as part of the aid effectiveness agenda, and don't just resort to looking at value for money, which is a danger. I would also say on that point that was raised about challenging public support, yes, it's true, and there are lots of European governments which are using this trade-off on aid effectiveness, or trading off aid effectiveness against aid quantity as a reason for not delivering on their volume. So this is something we have to be very, very aware of, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that. You know, the aid's not effective, therefore let's not bother delivering on the commitments. This is something we're going to need to challenge much more. Very briefly, mutual accountability. I agree, it's a very complex agenda, and it needs to be given a lot more thought in terms of what mutual accountability actually means. I have concerns that the work going on at the OECD DAC level is very, very technical and not political enough, and that is stopping us really from thinking about what real mutual accountability could be. And I think finally, just to come back to this point on sort of what aid effectiveness means, and you know, how can we make the system actually effective. I think one thing we need to come back to is the fact that, yes, it's true, as Alison says, we're looking at this within a certain framework which has already been established. And to some extent, you know, we need to work with that until we can get beyond 2011 and do some of the things that Matthew has been describing. I would also say that I do, however, disagree on this issue of sort of separating out the different phenomena and entities. So thinking about the taxation reform, which Rachel talked about in the context of the G20 communique, this stuff has got to be taken into account, because once you want to look beyond aid architecture at overall development effectiveness, you need to look to the whole system, and we need to talk about reforming that, and we need to make sure we're doing that in all of the relevant fora, not just the ones that are particularly powerful at this current moment in time.
Thank you, Jasmine, and I think that's a very good note on which to finish. I mean, I think we need to remember in many ways that actually certainly the framework that began with Paris and got pushed a bit further with Accra represents in many ways quite a unique consensus amongst donor agencies in aid history, really. We haven't had anything like this before. And it's very important, I think, that we stick with, but clearly focus very much on how we can improve. And I hope this discussion, and ODI would like to be involved in helping to have this discussion over the next few years on what actually we should be aiming for in terms of improvement to that framework post-2010. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Rachel, Nick, Mark, Matthew, and Jasmine.